Hey everyone, and welcome to this watercolor and color pencils tutorial. In this video I show you how to paint a portrait in only 5 steps. You can find a list with all materials and where to purchase them in the video description. Before we begin, if you want to download the preliminary sketch, the exact dimensions of the painting to recreate it, and see the full version of this painting lesson, which is 1.5 hours long, support me on Patreon at the $5 reward tier. The lesson teaches you step by step from beginning to end on how to paint this portrait, and you will be able to paint it like I did. Just follow the link in the description to watch the full lesson. Okay, let's start the painting process. I begin with filling out the face with a light skin tone. The goal is to build up to the color values that we can observe on the reference photo. Many beginner artists make the mistake that they either paint too dark in the beginning or they paint too light and they never reach the color values that are on the reference photo. So we are going to keep an eye on the color values all the time and slowly building up to them. By starting with a light skin tone in the face area, and we are building a base for later layers of watercolors and color pencils. While the paint is still wet in the portrait portion, we can add a little bit of red to the cheeks and a little bit of darker orange to the neck area so that the color can bleed out and create some smooth blendings. In the next step, we are going to paint the background. For this painting, I decided to make an abstract background. For many of my paintings, I put a lot of thought in the background and they are very elaborate and complicated, but when I do a portrait study, I don't want to put a lot of work into the background. I just want to focus on the portrait. However, that doesn't mean we can't make a beautiful background. And in order to make a beautiful background with abstract effects, first of all, we need to wet the entire area of the background. You can just use water for that or a light variant of the paint you want to fill in the background. I'm relatively bad with choosing what colors would fit to my portrait, and oftentimes I choose the wrong colors and nothing really fits together. So in order to stay safe, I like to paint with muted colors that are slight variations of the colors in the portrait. So here I'm going with a little bit of gold and ochre to add some first colors to the background area. Then I added a couple of splashes and dots with wet color into the wet area. Here you can see how pretty this wet on wet effect looks and how easily you can fill in an area with just a couple of brush strokes. I often use this effect to fill in areas that I don't know what to do with or that are not that important. Here again, it is important to choose colors that fit to the reference photo. It does help to make color studies in the beginning or try something out digitally with Photoshop, what I do most of the time, but here I just went with the colors of the portrait, which are grays, blues and browns. I'm working with the Komorebi watercolor palette from Mozart Supplies. You can find a link to their products in the video description, and I must say I really love this color palette. It is incredibly easy to work with. I even like it more than the high-priced Schminke watercolors that I usually use, because these watercolors can be lifted off very easily from the paper. But you can also build up layers with them, which is not something that I see in many watercolors. Either you can build up layers or you can lift them up, but not both. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, is when you paint with watercolors and the watercolor is dried, you can use a wet brush and go over the dried area or also over a wet area, and the brush will lift off some of the watercolor again. This is a very neat trick if you either want to correct a mistake, so maybe you have painted an area too dark and you want to make it a little bit lighter, or you want to smooth out edges. With my Schminke watercolors, it's very hard because the watercolor is super pigmented, and once it dried on the paper, there's pretty much no way to lift them off again. However, with the Komorebi watercolors, I have no problem whatsoever. I can lift off the watercolors and I can also build layers. So this is my first watercolor palette that I would recommend for beginners. It's really wonderful to work with it. If you have any good watercolors you want to recommend, just put them in the comment section. I bet there are many people who love to see what you are recommending us. Anyways, back to the portrait lesson. So the next step is that we let everything dry. You can use a hair dryer to speed up the process. However, when your paint is super wet and you use the hair dryer, it can happen that the paint flows in all directions, and some of the abstract effects might merge furthermore and you end up with some really weird effects. So if it's super wet, I just let my painting dry for maybe half an hour. Maybe you can see how much the abstract effects have changed after they dried. This is very normal. And the brand of paper and also the watercolors that you use have a huge effect on how the dried watercolor will look like. Here for this portrait, I didn't use my usual Fabriano hot pressed watercolor paper, which I use for almost all my watercolor paintings. I used a cheap watercolor paper, and the abstract effects didn't dry as I expected them to dry. Normally they make prettier edges and you have even more abstractions in them with the Fabriano paper, but on cheap paper or just generally on different sorts of paper, you get completely different behaviors of the watercolor. It makes sense to try out different kinds of papers to see what fits best to your style and what you want from your watercolor paper. The way that I paint makes me use some brands of paper, but you might want something entirely different. So definitely try out different kinds of paper and see what works best for you. After everything is dried, I continue painting on the portrait portion again. And here I'm continuing the process of building up to the desired color values. For example, I start mixing darker skin tones for the areas around the eyes and the eyebrows, and I also fill in the lips, the irises and the eyelashes. It is super important to paint the eyes even, especially the irises, and for that I'm using Neptune brushes and Neptune detail brushes. They are from Princeton. I have linked them in the video description. Currently they are my favorite brands of watercolor brushes. They give me the most control and they also hold lots of water. You can paint with cheap brushes. I painted with cheap brushes for the longest time, but if you want to have really good control over details, I definitely suggest to get a good detail brush. For something like irises and lashes, it's pretty hard to control the watercolor so that you don't get wobbly lines. So good brush is very helpful here. Or if you don't have a good brush, just try to hold your hand very still and try to get a clean line. It's definitely difficult and it takes a little bit of practice. If you don't get the lines right, you can correct it later with color pencils or even with gouache, which I do all the time because I don't get all the lines right all the time. I have wobbly lines too. I don't spend a lot of time adding values and more layers with the watercolors in the portrait portion because I planned to fill in most of the values with color pencils instead. This portrait doesn't have a lot of shadows. The photo is lit directly from the point of the viewer, so you don't get a lot of strong shadows, which makes the painting process a little bit easier because you don't have to get so deep and dark with the shadows, but it also doesn't make it look very deep and three-dimensional. So if you're looking to create a portrait that has a lot of depth and maybe looks very realistic, I would suggest using a photo that has a lot of shadows where the light comes from above, for example, and you have shadows directly beneath the nose, the eyes and the lips. But basically you can paint each photo that you find on the internet or that you take yourself, but keep in mind the light is an important factor for the painting in the end. In the next step, I'm continuing with the color pencils process. So my favorite color pencils are Polychromos from Faber-Castell, and I love them because they come in so many different color hues, which are perfect for painting skin tones. They are very pigmented, but they are also not too soft, so I have a lot of control even if I'm drawing details. I'm starting the color pencil process like I do the watercolor process. I'm picking a very light gray tone and begin to fill in the portrait portion in circular movements. If you want to know what exact colors and color hues I'm using for the drawing process, just watch my video on Patreon. There I'm explaining what colors I use exactly for the drawing process. After having added a first layer of gray, I'm continuing with ochre and with different brown and skin tones. I have a couple of skin tones that I really like and that I place over each other. So I never just use one color pencil hue and fill in the entire face or only 2 or 3. In fact, I always use at least 5 or 6 different colors and place all the pigments over each other to create the illusion of depth and of real skin. An important thing you need to know is when you draw with color pencils on watercolor paper that the tooth of the paper is always very visible, even if you use very matte and smooth paper. It will never look like actual drawing paper. So it is important that your pencils are sharp all the time, and when you draw with them, you have to pay attention on how much pressure you use. For example, in the beginning of the drawing process, I use very, very light pressure because the pencil strokes will be visible very strongly in the beginning. But then after having added a lot of color pencils on top of each other, I can increase the pressure and this way also flatten the paper during the process. So the paper will be very flat and smooth. The tooth of the paper will go away to an extent and everything will look better. And then in the end, I used the Luminance Pencil series from Caran d'Ache to smooth everything out. This is really my way to go trick that I use for every color pencil work, because the Luminance pencils are wax-based color pencils. They add a layer of wax on top of your pigments and they kind of fuse the pigments together. This is at least how it looks to me. It is important that you use them only in the last step if you really think you can't get any further with the Polychromos pencils, because once you have added the Luminance pencils and you draw over them with Polychromos pencils, for example, you can get really ugly patches because it looks different. The surface changed after you work with the Luminance pencils on the paper, because you have this coat of wax on top of it. I had this a couple of times when I switched back and forth from the Luminance to the Polychromos. Then I got some ugly patches on the skin, for example, and I could never get rid of them. So I try to really work out everything perfectly with the Polychromos pencils, and then in the end I use different kinds of Luminance pencils to smooth everything out. For example, for the darker parts of the face I use some darker shades of the Luminance pencils, and for everything else I use white or ivory, for example. After having finished the face, I continue working on the hair. And here again, I want to have it very abstract and loose and painterly. You don't have to do that. You can paint the hair realistically if you want, or not at all if you're only interested in painting the face. I mix a dark brown tone to paint the hair. I try to make each brush stroke look interesting, painterly or pretty, so that I don't have to correct them. I want the hair to look very loose and I want to make each brush stroke count. If you think about each brush stroke that you do, it can have a lot of impact on your painting. Sometimes it looks more aesthetically if you only used a couple of brush strokes to render something instead of thousands of different brush strokes. This of course depends on the style, and it isn't true for everything. Here for the hair, I think it was the right choice to just paint the hair in a couple of brush strokes. I started with adding the darker portion of the hair, and then for the tips I used a lighter shade of brown and I merged it while it was still wet into the darker parts on the hair, so that we have this beautiful watery effect and the blending between the two colors. And for the details I used the detail brush from Neptune to add a couple of fly hair and tiny hair strands to make everything more dynamic and lively. And for the last step we are going to have some fun. For me, this is really the best part of the painting. It feels amazing. I can get rid of all my loose energy that I might have accumulated over the day and I feel like a real painter. So I covered the face with Post-its and mixed a couple of different color tones, and then I splattered them widely over the portrait. This was so much fun. I really dig neon colors lately, and the Komorebi watercolor palette comes with a range of beautiful neon colors, and of course I had to add neon pink to the painting. The pink is so amazing that it can't be really caught in camera. So whenever I try to photograph, film or scan my painting, the neon pink is never going to show as it does in real life. Also, it is relatively light fast. I contacted the company. Some of you have commented on my videos that the neon colors are not very light fast, but compared to the other paints in the palette, they are as light fast as the other paints, but I will research for more info and let my patrons know about the light fastness, or maybe on my Instagram account. Anyways, I mixed a couple of those colors and just splashed them wildly over the painting. You don't have to do that yourself if you don't like splashes at all, or just a couple of them. This is the final step of the painting. And for the white splashes, I just used white acrylics. White watercolors or gouache is not very opaque, so I just didn't even bother with it and I just mixed white acrylics. And then in the end, I added some finishing touches on the face, because in the end you will notice here and there maybe some color values that you want to change or maybe some details. So the last step of the portrait for me is always correcting some little details here and there. And this is how I painted the portrait of CozyKitsune. Again, if you want to see the full lesson and follow my painting process step by step, support me on Patreon at the $5 reward tier. You get to download the reference photo and the preliminary sketch that you can then just print out and transfer onto your paper to start painting right away. Supporting me on Patreon gives you access to not only this, but to over 90 painting videos for only $5. Isn't that incredible? Check out my library of painting tutorials and lessons on lioba.info/tutorials. I hope you liked this video. If you did, don't forget to leave a comment, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next one. Bye bye!